Welcome, everyone. Bem-vindo a todas e a todos. Um, on, on behalf of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University, we are very happy to welcome Allan da Rosa. And I'm going to do a quick um, introduction to Allan in Portuguese. So all of you who have your headphones, I would put them in. Um, Allan da Rosa é
Allan da
escritor
Rosa is
e
a writer
angoleiro.
and capoeira
Integra
artist, a
desde o
Brazilian
princípio
martial art.
o movimento de
He's been a member of the
literatura
peripheral literature movement in
periférica de
São
São
Paulo
Paulo.
since its beginning,
Foi editor
and he was an
Clássico
editor
Selo,
for the classic
Edições
publisher
Toró.
Toró Publishing or Downpour
Historiador,
Publishing.
mestre,
He's a historian.
doutorando,
He has a master's in
faculdade
education
de
and is a
educação
doctoral student
da
in the College of
USP.
Education at the University of
Ali,
São Paulo.
na ocupação
There, in the
do
Black
Núcleo de
Consciousness Center, he
Consciência
took
Negra
and taught
do
classes
Cursinho
and helped people learn to read.
e alfabetizador.
He researches and lectures about Black ancestralities, imaginaries, and daily life, which, not coincidentally, is related to his talk today. For several years now, he's created self-standing courses on aesthetics and Afro-Brazilian politics in various peripheral neighborhoods of São Paulo. He's participated in lectures, workshops, presentations, and debates in roundtables, fairs, universities, libraries, and community centers in many states in Brazil and in Cuba, Mozambique, the US, Colombia, Bolivia, and Argentina, among other places. He's the author of From Cabula, which is a Bahian neighborhood, and won the 2014 National Black Dramaturgy Award. Zagaia, which is a young adult book. 2 books on CD, The Kalimba and the Flute, which is erotic poetry with Priscila Preta, and Mukondo, Lyric Mukondo, which won the 2014 Black Art Award from the National Arts Foundation, as well as the essay Pedagoginga, or Dancing Pedagogy, Autonomy and Escape, among other works. I want to ask everyone to give a great welcome to Allan da Rosa. Hey guys, how you doing? Good afternoon. I want to thank the ancestors that paved the way for us to be here and that give us knowledge and sensibility, sufficient sensibility, a lot more than we need. And we need to learn from what comes before. I would like to thank Brown for its invitation, the Watson Institute, Ramon, he's been great. He's treated me very well, with a lot of attention to a lot of detail. Thank you very much. I'm in the United States. I was in Chicago last week at Northwestern and the University of Chicago. And this week, in 3 days, I'll be in Boston, Harvard, a seminar with 30 activists and artists from Brazil. And then I'll be in Boston for 2 more weeks. I was at Brown in 2013 and at an invitation from Nelson Vieira from the Portuguese and Brazilian Studies Department. So I'm very happy to be here. My intention is always to help us leave better than when we came. So I hope that we can be fed with food and also in our ears and everything else. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? Everyone? The interpreter's helping you guys understand everything you need. Thank you very much for the interpreter. Sorry. Do you know that translation, it's a field, it's a very fertile field, and it's a struggle as well. There are studies and dances and a lot of conflicts and challenges in the field of translation and also the traditions of Black Brazilians. In Bahia, there's a field with this professor, with an independent editor of Black African work, and they launched a book called Translating in the Black Atlantic, a book about the needs the need for translations of works, of black works from, black Americans for Brazilian readers. We need to pay attention so that things don't get lost. We take a shower of stereotypes when we go into black studies, and I'm talking primarily about Ladino Africa. You guys know this term? Do you know Lélia Gonzalez? We talked about ancestors. She is a glorious woman who came from the interior of Minas Gerais and almost the center of Brazil, and she went to Rio de Janeiro. She resembles Carolina de Jesus, who came from the favela of Rio, went to São Paulo, she would collect cardboard and sell it, and she wrote this book called The Room of Disquiet. It's the most translated book from Brazil to more than 40 languages. Lélia Gonzalez, she goes to Rio to work in the magistracy, in the government. And there she finds out, and the city finds out. Sorry, she discovers herself and she discovers the city. She has one foot in the university, where she was a full professor at the Catholic University of Rio. She was studying Pan-Africanism, and very, very interconnected to the black culture of Rio, and the black culture that doesn't submit itself, that doesn't lower its head. And the field of cultural struggles and fights on the aesthetic map, everything happens. There are concessions that look like wins. There are wins that look like losses. Lélia Gonzalez, she was in the Quilombo, this samba school, which is also a runaway slave community. She broke off from another samba school, Portela, which is a really big samba school, and she's not happy with the way that black African culture is going in samba in Rio, and so she breaks off from it. So she participates in this samba school, in the religious scene, and she's also very strong and very active in the university. Lélia Gonzalez, she does a very critical reading and sympathetic reading about Pan-Africanism and Afro-centrality. She coins the term Latino-Americanidade to think about diaspora and movement. Latino has a meaning. Ladino has a different meaning. So when a so-called slave, gets to a place after crossing the Atlantic and isn't able to learn the language, he's called a boçal. He is kind of like a stammerer. When you start to absorb and to create in the language, you're called Ladino. So Ladino is dangerous because he is able to dominate two languages, or even if he doesn't have a mastery of the language, he at least can create in the language. Ladino is dangerous because he knows the code of the city, the white city, the elites. He knows what time we can get the water out of the gourds, what time we can take a bath, what time we can drown our enemies in the flood. So América, do I need to explain this? It's a Lélia Gonzalez term that she coined about the black presence in the Americas. So it's, and also from Mexico and on south, the stories are very similar with the black stories of the United States. They were different colonizations, different ways of dealing with national discourse. The national discourses were always about harmony, they put everything on the same level as if Brazilian and Colombian and Cubans were aware of the internal struggles. But at the same time, I was talking to Ramon a couple days ago, and there's an arrogance or an ignorance, a willful ignorance on the Brazilian consciousness related to Latin America. And also to América, or America and Africa put together, and Latina. These are details, these are combinations that are very comprehensible. It's very understandable that the southern elites in Brazil would like to appear more civilized or more modern or developed. And this also, they would like to mirror the United States and Europe. But at the same time, we have a lot of dilemmas in the country and in the cities, even in the most powerful cities like São Paulo, which is the struggle for demonstrating that that city is dripping its it's built on the hands that built up the city and the voices that tell stories in their little corners of the city, in their yards, in their roundtable discussions, and especially in the intersections, the crossways. I drink from a great source, a great master. Yeah, she studied here. I'm not sure exactly where she got her doctorate here, but she's a teacher in Imaginaries about performance. And she comes and meets these writers. I write theater in Minas, and she's kind of our godmother. And she talks about the intersection as a concept, a lived experience. I call it hot theory, which is the intersection as a basis that we have, a place that we have, and you can find it. You can. It's related to intersectionality, for example. The intersection is it gives us a lot of different paths. And the giro, the spin or the twirl of African life is represented in very different ways. And so I'm talking about black life in São Paulo, the presence that one of our struggles is that in addition to just being considered and contemplated in our ritual and artistic lives, because it's no secret that African Brazilian life is seen and visible, but we want to focus on the daily life as well. And it's in the daily life that we find the marks, the gestures, the conceptions of time, of love. It's in the daily life that our body fills our thought. When we eat, when we take our kids to school, when we take a bath, when we dress ourselves, when we sleep. It's this daily life, in the details, when we greet each other. It's in this context that we perceive differences that, you know, the entertainment industry and the vampire-like presence of those who only want the parties and the traditions and the stereotypical traditions. It's in the daily life that these things don't work. So it's possible for you to be stereotyped and frozen into a postcard that talks about samba, capoeira, candomblé, this Brazilian religion, Afro-Brazilian religion, the dance. And a lot of people come to these events and they they're illuminated, and they were like, oh wow, how Afro-Brazilian culture is very pretty, it's very beautiful, but on the day-to-day life, not just in the hard things, but in the emotional life of the daily life of Afro-Brazilians is where there are quilombagens or escapes from the society. I work with waters of the body and the waters of the city. I deal with the oldest black men. I study masculinity, people that are older than 65 years old and that lived in São Paulo. That was already a big city. It was already a locomotive, but in a contradictory way. There were waters in which you could sleep. There were waterfalls. The names of our neighborhoods in São Paulo communicate this to us. There's the new Vila, which is the waterfall, and there's other neighborhood names that are based on waters. And as I'm talking to these old men, when we talk to these older people, these men especially, we learn how the city, well, in terms of climate, São Paulo was very different. It's similar to what Providence is like now. It's rain. It's not a strong rain, but it's kind of a drizzle. So this is why it's called the city of the drizzle. And they would say, we would go 7 days at a time without seeing the sun. And in this specific neighborhood in São Paulo, we have Soap Street. Why is it called Soap Street? Because you slipped. You would slip. You couldn't go up the street because of the mud. You'd have 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. 2 steps up, 3 steps down. There's also the Golden Rose neighborhood. Oh, sorry, the Samba school. It moved to a different part of Rio. Sorry, a different part of São Paulo. And so things have changed a lot. So I talk to the older people, and I try and find out from the waters of the body. Speaking of water, we need to drink water. This is part of our daily life, and this water transforms itself into tears, in saliva, into urine, sperm, blood, sweat. And I research the imaginaries of these waters. So that's how I kind of deal with masculinity. One thing that's very important in the black presence in the city of São Paulo was called backyard soccer. Várzea is the kind of the open space by the fields. It's the border line between the soccer field and the many rivers and channels of the city. So you might call it Riverbank Soccer. There's a lot of pollution and trash in the rivers today. It smells terrible. And that's where the black populations are. They're either on the borders on the banks of the river or up on the hills. And depending on which side of the river you're on, you can be displaced. You can be evicted. So this riverbank soccer happens on the riverbanks, on the big plains next to, or the big flat spots next to the rivers. And so part of this riverbank soccer, you would have men and women coming together to cheer, to see, the classic games between one neighborhood and another, epic games. And when I talk with Seu de Cá, who's a master, a teacher, a composer, a soccer player who became a legend. He was never professional, but so I want to explain that there's a soccer movement that's not professional that also created the city or made the city spatialize itself or separate itself. We have the Chiete River, that are converted into borders within the city. So they moved the river. They would make them change course so that they could develop and build up the city. They made them more straight. These big rivers that used to be really curvy have become straight. And on the margins of these, or the banks of these rivers, there were a lot of fields. There were a lot of soccer fields. So these people would go to play. But it was a lot more than just soccer games that happened there. Sometimes the ball was just a detail. So there were conflicts. There were, separating borders and figuring out whose territory is whose. It was passing from childhood to adulthood, people becoming adults. And I asked myself, what about the waters from the body? And so I asked this old man, hey, do you have any memory of urine? And he remembers conflicts between neighborhoods that were resolved by these soccer teams. And he remembers these teams that would play and they would win 30 games in a row. They would go 2 years without losing. Because when they were losing, they would shoot the ball, or they would threaten people with death if they didn't win. So that's how you go 30 games without losing. This is very common. They play until there's 10 minutes left in the game, and then when there's 10 minutes left, they give up so that they at least tie, so that there's no death, so that nobody gets too mad and kills somebody. So they were all black young men who were playing against black young men from another neighborhood, and they refused to give up the game to lose on purpose. And so the ref was saying, it's better for you guys to give up. And all the spectators were saying, you guys are not going to leave alive if you don't give up. And they said, we're not going to give up. When there's 1 minute left in the game, they rushed the field, and they chased these guys off the field. And they knew that they were going to be killed unless they ran. So they went into the locker room, and it was about the size of this table for 11 or 15 people. It was dirt floor. It wasn't really a bathroom or a locker room. It was a very, very simple just structure. And so they were stuck inside this locker room, just wondering about the last minute of the game. And so this old man, Sr. Chika, he said he felt a hot liquid on his thigh, and he'd wet himself because he was so scared. Which is, when we wet ourselves, in these moments. You think about moments of masculinity and violence. So going back to this story, one of the leaders, he was really big physically, an old Indian, and he was actually after a councilman in São Paulo. He came and said, nobody's going to mess with these boys. Nobody's going to kill them. You can come out. And so they opened up a space, and those 11 soccer players, they left. They made their way through these spectators who were going to kill him, who were going to beat him up. And, he helped him out. And then this Jika, this Mr. Jika, he said, do you remember this feeling, that hot feeling on your leg as a corporeal memory? And he's like, no, it wasn't exactly like that. Because it's not good to ever admit that you felt afraid. When we deny ever having felt fear or weakness, it's because there's something about being a man that doesn't allow them to admit that. There are other examples. When you think about the waters of the body or the fluids of the body, to understand racial relations, interracial relations in São Paulo, and between the lower class and the so-called middle class or elite in São Paulo. Sweat. When I interview another master, Osvaldo, he talks about tears, a lot of police encounters, and you had to have the Bible in your hand. But do you know what the Bible is? It's not the book, the Christian book. The Bible was your worker's ID. You had to have it in your pocket with your other ID, your worker's ID. We have another document which is called your it's kind of like your state ID that you always have to carry. That document is a document of a vagabond, of a bum. It wasn't that you needed. You needed your work document. And that continues today. I'm talking about just the past. So one of these guys, he reminds me that he used to work as a reporter. There's a young man, a black man, who stopped. The police humiliate him. They ask him where he's going, and he says, I'm a reporter. I'm going to work. And they said, well, we're going to let you go, but if you publish anything in your newspaper, we already know what time you get off work. And all the buses and everyone around was seeing that humiliation. And this happens today, still. Sometimes it's even worse. And sometimes, in addition to or beyond just being patted down by the police, there's deaths and there's murders at the hands of the police. So, one of these guys is saying, these police encounters, they're becoming more lethal. They're becoming less or more brash, more accepted by political leaders, accepted by TV program, anchors and directors. So there's a Brazilian sociologist called Floresta Fernandes, and I disagree with her on some things and agree with her on other things, and him, excuse me. He talks about blackness in class relations. So after this, he reflected on what he wrote, but there's something about his work that in 1940, when he writes about the situation, the terrible situation of the black population in São Paulo, where women were able to get work as maids in houses, semi-slaves, or when they could talk on the phone but not appear, so they could be operators. And that's for the few who were able to speak Portuguese the way that the elites wanted them to. And the men were not able to find work, black men. So the whitening of the city of São Paulo in the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil had an abolition of slavery on May 13th of 1888, where officially the end of slavery was decreed. So in this moment, São Paulo, only 10% of the population in São Paulo was still enslaved. So after this moment, actually before, but in this moment, there's this growing of, in the elite, who were the coffee planters, the coffee families, that's where the money came from. There was a process of whitening, of purifying of the nation. And this is not just my take on things. This is not a theory. Because we have documented proof. We have a lot of documents about the immigration authority, for example. There was advertisements on matchboxes sent to Italy to convince Italians and other Europeans to say, come work in Brazil and we'll pay you well. So they wanted to bring white people in and whiten the population, which also resulted in black people not being able to get jobs. So we were in limbo, where black men couldn't find jobs, and they would just go on the streets, and this continues today, where they'd get informal jobs. It was called the informal market, and women's could get positions. And Lorena Teles has a book about this, and he talks about 1920. What were the jobs that black women were getting? So, São Paulo would receive these black women to work in people's houses as maids, and that's where there was sexual violence, harassment, aggression, and so the women were able to find jobs. The men couldn't. They would light street lamps. They would exchange. They'd give change. They would operate the switches on the railroad tracks, and there were a lot of deaths because of this. The middle class, the black middle class, were those who were able to eat twice a day, and they established the Brazilian Black Front, and published things, newspapers. There was a series of newspapers that talked about soccer teams, black soccer teams in São Paulo, because black players couldn't play on other teams until 1954. Black players were not allowed to play on the professional teams and on the semi-professional teams. So we talk about Jim Crow, we talk about segregation. I'm talking about São Paulo in 1950. You couldn't play on a white team. After the big soccer organizations, once they found out that black players were really good, they come and say, "Hey, come play on our team, and we'll give you a special document of the team, but not of the club. You can play on the team, but you can't go into our club. You can't go into our building." So there were some fields that were only open to white people and not to blacks. So how does this fit in with the national discourse of Brazil? How does this fit in when we talk about segregation, apartheid, South Africa, the south of the U.S.? And we're thinking about Brazil in 1950. If I'm talking about Brazil in 2018, I could keep on telling the same stories. But they're not, for now at least, they're not institutionalized. So if we look at the day-to-day, institutionally, Brazil is less racist than it was, but in the day-to-day life of black people, it's the same exact situation. They're mistreated and they're looked down on. So these black soccer teams, Flor do Ó, São Geraldo, they were teams of players that were concentrated in black spaces of the city. There were already the different neighborhoods of the city, these Bexiga, Casa Verde. They were neighborhoods that were black. And when the black newspapers would talk about the games, it's very interesting to see because what type of news were published. The Redemption newspaper, this newspaper for the black community, and also it's worth thinking about the level of the people who were literate, and there were not very many literate blacks in the day, but they would still publish these newspapers. And so when you go on Sunday, you go to these Riverbank Soccer games, and you say. And you see that this team won 4-0 over Três Cravos. The next day, how do you think that the news was published? It was totally different from the sports news we see today, because they would publish and talk about things that were systematically denied to black people. So I'm going to explain myself. So when there's this whitening of Brazil, there's a semi-biological explanation. Turn of the century, from 19th century to the 20th century in Brazil and also in other countries in South America, but especially in São Paulo, there's this process of whitening and of searching for immigrants from European descent you know, the Chinese immigrants were also kind of looked down on, and there were a lot of cartoons and political cartoons that showed the negative attitude toward Chinese. And so there's this cartoon of a little white man between a big Chinese head and a big black head, and just showing, you know, the racism and the how people look down on this immigration. So they would treat these people as animals. There was this racist, scientific racism. And so in these, being mistreated by society and industries, it was, they used to say that blacks they weren't disciplined, that they couldn't work hard. And so these families just said, we're not slaves anymore. They would go into these factories. And they would go into these factories, but they were still perceived and still treated as slaves. So there was this, you know, malandragem, which is kind of like being a gangster, being a bum, because you got to survive. You don't fit into this system, and it creates a lot of problems. So Floresta Fernandes in the 1940s, he talks about, he defines society, Brazilian society. He talks about the racial horror in São Paulo. So as a hybrid of a class and caste system. Caste and class hybrid. That's how he defined, you know, the São Paulo society in sociological terms, talking about the integration of black people in São Paulo. Why? Why was there this horror? Because these black players, when they were, you know, when they were mentioned in the newspapers, they would say, "Oh, this team won 4-0. The team showed such discipline, such absolute skill and tactical skill. The coldness of the players, the logic of the players is very highlighted. You didn't talk about the goals or the plays of the exciting moments in the game. The black press intentionally showed how those teams were capable of being cold and kind of calculating, tactical obedience, intelligence on the field. This might seem like a little thing, but it's a subtle way of showing the humanity of blacks within a larger system of propaganda that never tired of saying you're not human and you can't work in these factories. And that's why we're bringing immigrants to work, because you guys, you're not capable. You can't concentrate for 8 hours. You can't follow orders because you're lesser, you're inferior. This is the beginning of the 20th century, and this racial discourse of superiority and inferiority based on race was reinforced by the elites from América Latina. So these soccer games, these waters, they tell a story. So before soccer existed, on the banks of the city water, the river waters, water has always been an attractive attractor because of its economic role in a city that for a long time didn't have plumbing, basic plumbing to distribute water, and also because of the possibility of remembering the crossing of the Atlantic, something that has always been a part of that journey from across the Atlantic. Akalunga, which is this reference to Africa. It's in a tear, it's in a doll, we're always talking about this crossing. You guys know what camburão is? It's the police car. It's a police So they say every police car has a little bit of a slave ship. It resembles a slave ship a little bit. In 2018. How do these waters from our body express our joys? When Faustino tells me that when he gets on the bus and the driver or the guy who taking the money, he says, "Let's go. Let's not let this guy get on." After the police let him go, he cries. And he makes a puddle on the bus of his tears. But to the same man, when I ask about his sweat, so he tells me, sweat. We have that biblical story about the man being condemned to live by the sweat of his brow, and that God condemned Adam, and now you're going to live by the sweat of your brow. Remember? And I said, yeah, I remember, Mr. Faustino. He said, well, to me, it's something else. For me, it's pleasure. It's dancing. It's loving. He's a very short, very fat, bearded man. He's like, I love being dripping in sweat from dancing a lot. So what does dance mean to him? What does loving mean to him in a daily life? That he who has a body that's looked down on by society, and just like all these old men are telling me, almost always, we feel like we're foreigners. São Paulo isn't our city. So this feeling of neighborhood, this feeling of ethnicity it's much more strong than identifying with this São Paulo city. So in the 90s, this started to change with rap. Rap keeps these boundary lines. They're talking about your space, your neighborhood. But also they have a consciousness of their peripheral condition. So in São Paulo until the 70s or 80s, it wasn't a city where the majority identified themselves as on the periphery, because lots of blacks lived in the center of the city. But in the 1990s, there's this discourse of blacks on the periphery, on the margins of society. And so it's not enough to be from São Paulo. It's what neighborhood in São Paulo are you from? What area are you from? So, and this continues until today. There's 2 years ago, there's a lay about the periphery, a law about the periphery, and between a lot of groups, women, gays, whites, blacks, but mostly black. So on the peripheries of the city, they organize and they map. They look at the legal actions and the budget that's given, and they create this report that shows how things are distributed in the city and how they're divided along neighborhood lines. And geographers and historians look at it after, and they're really amazed at the sophistication of this report that they made. The details that look at the peripheral neighborhoods versus the center of the city. Even the poor neighborhoods in the center of the city, are more privileged than those on the periphery. It was a surprise for Haka Honik, who was a really big geographer and human rights activist in São Paulo. But it was very, very surprising to her. So what people are these? What waters are these? The urine from fear, the sweat from pleasure. What waters are these from the city, from the floods? What relationships do we have from long ago, the black populations with the middle and upper class in São Paulo? Let me see what time it is. What time is it? Okay. So I still have time. We have the need, a need for contemplating the way we educate in school, in our own communities, it's very easy to see how the groups that dispute and fight over political power, the governmental institutions, they continue to be, or they continue to announce, to reproduce, to propagate racism in Brazil. It doesn't matter if it's the left or the right or the center. In these fields, all the stereotypes that we've been talking about are still present. Lots of times we look at history, we look at the present, the daily life of black people, and the way we organize. They're looked down upon. They're made to be subaltern. I'm not talking about just about these different this specific neighborhood or that samba school. I'm talking about ways of organizing and living in the day-to-day. For example, the way that water is distributed in the city, the public education that wants to, the teachers that are in the public schools, they're kind of dancing and navigating between the institutional racism and their personal beliefs. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of what the educational spectrum looks like in São Paulo today. So these are a few courses that we've organized on the peripheries of São Paulo. So there's this law that's 10639, which comes about in 2013, and it makes mandatory the teaching of Afro-Brazilian history and culture in Brazil, because it was and continues to be minimalized or stereotyped. Before, it would talk mostly about slavery as African history, but now it's starting to change a little bit. In the Temer government, who's the current president of Brazil, this law has been repealed. And so now there's a new educational model, this reform that focuses on technical aspects of education rather than humanist aspects. So my state, the São Paulo state and city, has tried to put this into practice for a long time, which is to make education into a big mall. So these are the courses that we've organized, or the classes that we've organized. This was the first course. I am Capoeira. And then there's also African paths, Afro-Brazilian spins or twirls. They're free classes. People come. They have to come to each of the 6 meetings, 6 Saturdays. That's the only requirement. So we talk about them. We spread the word in communities, and we try and get every type of person there. Thieves, prostitutes, doctors, trash collectors, everyone from every aspect of society, and we try and get them there. And most importantly, we want to attract educators, artists, and activists from those specific communities. Then we did this one, which is Black Spiral, Science and Movement, and what we call science, discipline, geography, math, and this story of black movement. For example, the geometry of rhythm, fraction, and dance steps. So there's this old black man who's a musician and a composer teaching the class together with a mathematician. Samba, territory, and geography. So there's a geography teacher giving a class together with an old black woman who talks about the neighborhood geography. I'm not talking about. We're talking about human geography. We're talking about climate, transportation, circulation, and that's kind of how it goes. This we talked about black presence, as it's written in up top. Blackness in Bolivia, which is very little. It's not discussed very much. in Cuba and Haiti, black theater in Brazil, relationships between Argentine literature and Argentine literature and its black population. You guys know I like soccer, right? So literature, soccer, and blackness. So how can we understand our society through literature and football? Lima Barreto, who was a Brazilian writer in 1918, writes a text called The Ashamed Nation. When the Brazilian soccer team goes to play in Argentina, 1918, and the team has black players from Rio. So, and the media at the time, they talked about, wow, what a shame. We're so embarrassed that these black people are representing Brazil. And so, the next day, Lima Barreto, he publishes this text, Ashamed Nation. And so we work with this text. And I mean, even today, they say a black guy can't be a goalie. No. Not on the, he doesn't have he's not calm enough, he's not calculated enough to be a goalie. Because we have an example of a black goalie who made a mistake in the World Cup. The question is, who can make mistakes and who will be condemned for that mistake forever? So we talk about soccer and business, literature, soccer, and blackness. There's another one which talks about theater, which is different types of blackness on the stage. So, I'm talking about experimental theater, black experimental theater. And this Nascimento, who actually gave, he taught in Buffalo. What is experimental black theater looking for in the 1950s? Why did he do Othello? Why did he do a version of Othello? When we look at biographies, what we look at in thesis and in research about black theater in Brazil, we don't really see. When we look at theses on theater, we don't really see black theater. We just see mainstream theater. And on TV, and on current theater, modern theater in Angola, it kind of turned everything on its head. Tradition and what it means to be contemporary. So we looked at aesthetics and politics. For some, it was more aesthetics than politics. Others, it was more politics than aesthetics. But we kind of gauged everyone's expectations and then went from there. There was a lot of theater. I wanted to know a little bit more about politics. So they would poll people after their classes and then make adjustments after. So, we would always be trying to revise and improve. Resistance and enunciation. And there's this plant that grows between the rocks. These are the courses. And these are the students. This is done in this specific theater where I taught capoeira. Black theater. Theatricality. Black presence in the Americas. Understanding economy and representation, imaginaries. So, is there theatricality here? Is there representation here? Is there presentation and representation? If I represent something here, if I represent kind of a black scene here at the university, that means something. But if I go home, I go to the street, if I go to the daily life of black people when they're talking in the street, when they're in their house, what's the differences between representation and presentation? So lots of times we've stopped doing this. What's the relationship between what he's holding and the classic figurine and knowing that not everyone can hold what he's holding in this picture? You need to know, you need to have a lot of experience, a lot of life experience to be able to hold what he's holding. Daniela is here. So black teachers are not very common in Brazil. I don't know how it is here. We have black teachers in the schools and the universities, but in Brazil, there's a very, very small number. It's an embarrassing number of teachers, and so she has a doctorate. So here's Othello, Shakespeare's Othello. Here are some of the newspapers, and this is titled "Racist Children." Here are the exercises that we do during the classes, during the courses. Contemporary theater in Angola. We try and represent our realities. And then there's the Afro dance. What does it mean? In the 1950s it starts. What dimensions of black dance or Afro dance persist? There's relationships between Candomblé, which is a syncretist religion of African and Brazilian. How does that influence and affect? We make signs, we make posters. We invite the teachers to write about what they're going to talk about. This was the first class, class about geography and movement, and I talked about the way we teach and the way we perceive pedagogy. We need this body, the waters of the body, to enter into reflection. We need to reflect about them, because I've learned how much our cognition needs abstraction and vision, but it's much more effective when we involve our whole body. Smell, touch, taste, heat, emotions, how these things awaken and allow us to share wisdom and knowledge. So, for example, we would study geography. In this class, we needed leaves to understand the relationships between city, field, the forests, bodies, peripheries, and these leaves they're rich. They have meaning in the kitchen, in medicine, in religion, in memories of grandfathers and grandmothers and children, and they have their shape, their texture, their smell. All of this goes into learning geography. And this is the little, this little rivulets that I'm talking about. São Paulo has 1,000 of these. They're dirty, they're polluted. But despite all this, when it's nighttime, you can sleep hearing the music of the river. Maybe it smells bad, maybe it's ugly, maybe it's full of bottles, but the sound of the river is the same sound as any river, any mountain stream. And this helps create our environment. This makes me forget that you're not in an apartment in the center of São Paulo. So sometimes you're looking for trash or you're looking for bodies in these streams. And that's part of our geography. And is it possible for us to incorporate this into our teaching? So there's this geography class and mineralogy. So for example, I would go through this stream every day, and I didn't realize that I was stepping on quartz or other minerals. And so this teacher's helping us understand what we're walking through every day. This has to do with the work environment, the possibility of owning land or at least belonging to land, community strength. There's also classes about, this is our, unfortunately she's passed away, Hooch, but plastic arts. She would talk about the difference between function and aesthetic enjoyment. In African arts and in a lot of Afro-Brazilian arts, we didn't have really so much difference between function and aesthetic pleasure. We didn't have arts to just look at and enjoy. But we had this bench, for example. This bench, you can sit on it. But what does it mean? What does it express? So for a long time, not just in relation to Africa, but in relation to Afro-Brazilianness, the works of art they weren't attributed to specific artists. They would just say it's from the Afro-Brazilian community. And she would say, no, we know who made this bench. We know who made this work of art, and we need to attribute it. So this relationship between aesthetics and power, these are all things we talk about in these courses. And we have to get our hands dirty to learn. This is a class about gender relations, cloth, in the cloth workers in Mozambique and in Brazil. And so, in addition to abstract, concepts, we would make them concrete as well. So I'm showing you different neighborhoods of São Paulo. This is Quilombaque, and this is to help you understand mathematics. So we went to this place, and I study the Imaginaries specifically. This is our teacher, Marcos. What can this... what does this sculpture that you made mean? About your desires, about the malleability of the earth, the challenge, the artistic challenge between conceiving the idea and making it concrete, which is part of the work of any creator, between the mind and the fruit or the result. You imagine, and you are able to make material, make real your idea. So, and we also have, as I said, the right and the need to do abstract contemplation, abstract thought. So we have both. We have the concrete and we have the abstract. In this class, for example, we got together Marcelo and Mr. Batista to talk about the plastic arts and representation. So this is the goal that we have in our educational activities, the older people and the younger people giving classes, teaching classes together. So the older guy, he brought a bunch of wood for us to understand what the differences are between the wood. What wood do you use to make chairs? What do you use to make houses? What woods you use to court other people, to date? You know that cinnamon is a really important wood for that. And also the reflections about, making things in 3D. How many dimensions do we see? Do we experience? There's this math class about mathematical composition. So this samba school that I was talking about, it was famous for singing about São Paulo. Rosas is this area that's in the top of the mountains of the north zone of São Paulo, which is an area there's a geographical limit, right? There's this mountain that divides everything. So to the south, the east, and the west, you can see everything. To the north, there's this boundary, this mountain. And the members of the samba school they would be up on top of the mountains and be looking down at São Paulo. And so they would sing about mathematics and the shape of the city and the layout of the city. And they would have this mathematical approach to their music and to their view of the city. And so this teacher, he's going to talk about the theory of it and also the practice of it. The mathematics of the construction of houses on the banks of the river, of these different games that we play, the musical compositions, how mathematics permeates all of that, the presence and the expansion of blackness in São Paulo, in the different economic periods that he's talking about, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the industries. These things that have been happening for the last 150 years, these mathematical ways of creating the cities. Maria Helena, she's talking about territory and geography. She's looking at Brasilândia, which is another area. of Várzea. This is the soccer, the Riverbank Soccer that I was talking about. So there's there's more people watching this soccer game than the pros. Contemporary art. There's a class about Lélia Gonzalez and Carolina de Jesus. We think about the faces in the 50s and 70s and 90s. This was a class about this guy. He's from this specific area, and he talked about contemporary African film. And so we do workshops, and then we watch contemporary films from Africa to understand better, a little bit more about the aesthetics of Africa, and what society it is that creates those films. So I'm almost done. So we go to the banks of these little streams, and we do a class about archaeology. Talking about quilombos, or these runaway slave communities. I'm looking for the specific picture. So Patrícia, she's an archaeologist. She's a doctoral student, and she studies archaeology of quilombos, these runaway slave communities in Brazil. And so we feel the need to think about these quilombos, these communities, and there's still not very much. There are very many digs on quilombos because there's a lack of funds and a lack of interest as well. But there on the banks of the river, where she buried like indigenous pottery shards and things like that that would appear in quilombos. And so we go there, we dig up and we find these pottery shards, we feel them, we smell them, and we kind of act like archaeologists. And then we go back to analyze the different pieces that we found. And we think about the mud, the clay, and how we are kind of crippled, how we're kept distant from our own history. And this archaeological knowledge is not just from the 1600s. It's also from 1930, when the city, as I was saying, even today we have legal fights about against evicting people and tearing their houses down just to build freeways. For who? For the elites. This doesn't just happen today. This happened in the 1930s, 1940s. There were whole neighborhoods of São Paulo that were demolished. And do you know the names? Champs-Élysées. That's what they called them after they demolished them. Higienópolis, which means hygiene, Hygieneopolis. These were black neighborhoods, but they demolished them. They made them more hygienic, so that now they could be a human place. Now that we could have white people living there, because black people are disgusting. They're dirt, and the record of the national history. And I'm not just talking about 1800s, 1940. I'm also talking about 2017, 2018, 2012. Talking about generations of Africans or Afro-Brazilians who deal with this. Ever since I came here, statistically, 4 young people have just been killed. In the time that I've been talking, 4 young black people have been killed in São Paulo, statistically speaking. And it's normal. It doesn't make people surprised or sad anymore. Murders happen in São Paulo, in our neighborhoods. There was another. The other day, I was reading a newspaper, and it was talking about, oh yeah, he was in the wrong place, or they must have been doing something wrong. He was in the bar. Oh, well, if he was in the bar, then what was he doing in the bar at 10 o'clock at night? It's his fault. I'm not exaggerating. We can look at whatever article and look at the comments, and these are the comments that people make. But if this happened in one of the neighborhoods of the middle class or the elites, it would be a national story. The young people that are in the same bars at 10 o'clock at night, but they have their own security, they have their own guards, they have police escorts. So I don't know how this fits in your heads and in mine. When I think about the national imaginary, that this discourse that opportunities are the same for everyone, that racism doesn't exist in Brazil, that there's no segregation. So I ask myself and I ask you, what is the need for our literature and our fiction, black fiction? What are the potential? What's the potential for black fiction? What questions can they raise? I'm a writer of fiction. This is why I came to Chicago, and this is why I'm going to Harvard. I would have loved to have read with you a couple of short stories, and for us to engage with these stories, thinking about imagined versus real realities. Because the imagination is also something real. It's not something abstract. It's not something up in the Milky Way, up in the clouds. No. The imaginary is this person who's touching the clay, touching the mud, and who touches other things in their daily life, touches their own body. What does it mean for a black man to touch another woman? Or to ride on a bus? What kind of transportation is available to the black populations in Brazil today? And we got to think about this, because otherwise we're gonna end up reproducing the same systemic racism, systemic oppression that we're fighting against. We don't ask enough questions right now. We're so certain of what we know that we don't ask any questions, and that's a problem. We need to have questions. We need to have doubts. I don't know if everyone's right. I don't know what's right, and what we need to ask. We need to ask. So we're thinking about geography, and we're thinking about people in the spaces they live in. We want to contaminate or infiltrate the schools, but not be schools. All right, thank you very much.
Se tiver alguma pergunta,
are there any questions?
If anyone has a question, we have a little bit of time.
We have a little bit.
I mean, we're supposed to run till 1:30, but we can go a little bit longer. So if anyone has a question, either in Portuguese or in English, feel free to ask. I'll just be passing around this microphone.
Muito obrigado pela
Thank you very much
apresentação,
for your
Allan.
presentation.
Foi maravilhoso
It's great
ouvir sobre
to hear
o seu
about
trabalho.
your work.
Tem uma pergunta.
I have a question
você falou
about,
sobre
you talked about
encruzilhadas,
these crossways.
Né? E isso como uma semelhança com interseccionalidade. E eu estou querendo saber como isso está mostrada no trabalho de vocês.
So I wanted to see how that is represented in your work. How these meetings, how do you guys
do lugar
talk
da
about
mulher negra,
the place of the black
das
woman,
pessoas negras trans, das
trans
pessoas negras gays,
people who are black,
como vocês falam
black
sobre
gays.
classe,
How do you talk about
essas
class? These
como
crossroads.
vocês falam, como vocês tratam
How do you talk about it
esses
and treat it
aspectos?
in your work? So I made an analogy between crossroads and intersections, which are shapes that orient us. We want to go along beyond binary ways of thinking. It's not just me or him that's going to talk. The women are talking for themselves in those courses. So when Flavia or Daniela, when they talk about these things, they present another perspective. About trans people, it's a gap that we haven't thought about, and we need to think about it. But in Harvard, you're trying to go there, right? So Erika Malunguinho is a great friend of mine. She's a trans woman, and she is an uneducator. When I think about conceptual relations between intersectionality and crossroads, it's because it's not enough to think about just class or just gender. You have to think about first. I mean, we have to take this step to considering these different kinds of things. Generally, people think like these things aren't we can't talk about them. But there's but talking about these things helps people understand better. So, and the crossroads shows us that it's not just this street that makes that creates a space. It's the relationship of this street with the other street with the other street. And there are lots of people that have taught us that things have more than one meaning, and that our traditions. I'm not an idealist of traditions. Traditions can be very oppressive, but they're very fertile as well, and we need to understand them. There's a really great researcher, a Puerto Rican woman, lesbian researcher, and she talks about how there are, in the Western feminism, there's a very liberal social democratic attitude, and how this kind of rejects or ignores lots of the history of our communities. And I don't have time to talk about it all in 10 seconds, but she presents us with, for example, a perspective that includes history and the present, politics, aesthetics, race. And I think when we think about our heritage of the crossroads kind of thinking, which is not something I'm just making up, this is a black tradition of thinking. Now that we're in this 20th century, we've kind of unlearned those things. We've learned to think only in these binary perspectives, and this is totally understandable. I'm not trying to blame anyone, but I mean, rap is something that has done this as well. And I was raised with rap, but we need to show the struggle. We need to show how the system is. And we also need to talk about the contradictions. Talk about Toni Morrison is a writer who I think does this really well. She shows how she's not gonna. She shows the system. She doesn't like kind of discount it and say everything's hunky-dory, but she also talks about individual people. Each character of Toni Morrison is not a heroine. It's not a victim. She's a crossroads. She's unfair. She's weak. She's strong. So this kind of crossroads thinking, this way of understanding the world, I don't want it to just be a concept. I want it to be a part of my thinking, and part of my work. It's a heritage. It's a tradition, a conceptual tradition that we have, and in Brazil and maybe in other places as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, okay. If you guys want to come take a look at my books, you're welcome to. You guys can see how we're making our books.